and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Tonight and through these past couple of months as well with our previous part of this series. But we really appreciate your support and your passion for hearing what Adam has to share. So we really appreciate it. If you did happen to miss part 1 or 2, they are on our YouTube channel. And this event will also be uploaded to the YouTube and shared to all registrants in the next couple of days. So please check out, here's the link is in the chat. That's our YouTube where you can find the previous part recordings. But for tonight's program, we ask you, as always, to please remain muted during the presentation to respect the speaker and the other guests. You may keep your cameras on or off, whatever you are more comfortable with. And if you could please rename your Zoom name to whatever name you use to register for the event, that is very helpful for us to keep attendance. But to briefly reintroduce our speaker, Adam Zgola specializes in Japanese wooden construction, and he has spent the last 21 years living, training, and working professionally in Japan to build and restore traditionally designed houses. Tonight we'll be hearing a little more from Adam to continue our past session conversations. And later on in the program, we'll be also joined by our director, Naoko Takayanagi, in kind of a Q&A. And then finally, at the end, we will have an audience Q&A session. So you may add your questions in the chat box at any time. We'll address them at the end. And we also wanted to say that Adam is open and actually encourages open conversation with everyone in the program. So at the very end, if anyone would like to voice their questions directly through the audio or video, please feel free to kind of jump in if there's a space, or you may use on Zoom at the bottom under reactions. There's an option to raise hand, as I've done just now. So it says reactions. You can raise hand and lower hand. So if you'd like to kind of speak to Adam directly, share your thoughts, questions, anything you have to share to the group, we are open to that as well at the end of the program, the last couple 10-15 minutes or so. But I know we have a lot to get through today, so I will hand it over to Adam for now.
Thank you, Joanne. Once again, it's a pleasure being with you this morning/evening. This is the third part of the series. It's the final part, and I realized that I had great expectations to cover more than we actually could. So I'm going to try and get a little bit more in this evening. We talked about the kominka, the farmhouse, last time, and at the end, I kind of rushed into structure, and we started talking about Japanese frame structure and geometry. And I'm going to take that as a departure point today, but shift gears into the joinery, because I think a lot of people who are interested in Japanese architecture and Japanese carpentry, a lot of it has to do with the complicated joints that are used to connect wood together and to be the basis for the frame. So I'm going to start with that, and I'll have some photos to show you as I go through it. And I've thought about this a lot, mainly because now we're at a stage in Japanese architecture where the vast majority of buildings are still timber frames, but they're CNC machined. They're mass produced. And the reason for that is that, of course, there's a delineation, there's a demarcation in Japanese architecture from pre-war and post-war, and the economic boom after that. And you can see that buildings that were made before the war are still very much handmade, and they were. Then after the war, there was this drive to rebuild the country, and things had to be built very quickly. They were still done by hand, but the level and the attention to detail had to be secondary compared to production. But as soon as the economy started picking up, and of course, an economy needs commerce, and making things quickly is always a good thing in that kind of environment. And so the drive to mass produce housing was actually really important, and it's just gone a little bit too far, in my opinion. So the vast majority of houses are not hand cut, and as a result, the joints are not hand cut. And so when we're training young carpenters now to be able to hand cut a frame, you have to explain why, because it's not something they're being asked to do every day now, right? So I think about that a lot. And one of the things that I use to explain it is that even though the way that we're making houses might have changed over the past 60, 70, 80 years, what has not changed is the domestic timber that people use to make these houses. So if the wood hasn't changed, if its mechanical properties, the way it's grown hasn't changed, then the techniques that were developed using that wood should not, right? There is that intrinsic logic, that wisdom that I like to try and follow. And so that's where we're going to start. That was really jumpy. There you go. This will be a little bit. So that was still a little jumpy. But that's the bidding at the auction in Yoshino in Nara. And Yoshino in Nara has a very, very long history of forestry, 400 years of forestry history, meaning that people have been planting and maintaining those forests for that long. And in Japan, there's old growth forest like we had in North America. We still have in North America, and it's very prized. And unfortunately, there's not much left of it anymore. And so everybody knows from a North American context is that second growth forests are not nearly as good, right? And the reason for that is that everything starts off at the same time. And so a wide open sky is available to all the seedlings. So they grow very quickly. And it's only after they start shading each other that they slow down, right? Japanese people knew that. And Yoshino is famous for planting the seedlings very, very close together. And what that does is it makes the growth rings very, very, makes the growth rings very, very dense from the beginning. From the beginning. And so Yoshino Sugi is famous for that. And it was initially made and designed for wooden casks, the vats for transporting sake, Japanese rice wine, to the capital in Edo, because it was necessary for all the shoguns, all the daimyos, to spend at least more than half the year in Edo, away from their castles, away from their safe place, and that was a good way to control them. But as a result, they also had to bring gifts and lots of stuff to entertain the court. And of course, there was lots and lots of rice wine being transported from Nara, from Kyoto to Edo. And so they had to make these vats. And so, yeah, people, I think someone said, yeah, wow, that's some really dense growth rings. And the calling card of Yoshino Sugi is that within 30 centimeters or 30 millimeters of width, you need to have at least 13 years of growth. Right, so that's quite dense. Not as dense as initial growth, but as far as second growth is quite fantastic. And I kind of skipped this, if you can see here, and I'll be able to zoom in. That's why this one didn't get sold, because at a very young age, there was either too much wind, or there was a lot of ice and it froze during the winter, and you get water expansion, you get a crack. And maybe it was weak, and when it was felled, it cracked, and that's where that log doesn't get sold. People are very, very, very specific about it. And
there's a question from Kenneth asking about, there seems to be a lot of smoke in the background of the video and these photos.
That is fog. And oh, okay, this smoke, yes, that's from a drying kiln. Not very common in this area, mainly because this is smoke, the rest is fog. This is smoke. Most of the Yoshino Sugi is air dried. It takes very, very long, but this would be a whole topic. We'd spend the whole evening on wood, and but there's reasons why natural drying is always the best solution. for seasoning wood if you have the time. You should take the time. But no, it's very foggy, and because there's so much humidity in Japan, I think people who've been here and spend time here is that it's that humidity and that moisture, and that's where we're going to go. I'm going to skip through, but I'll get back to that mainly because what I wanted to talk about was this. This was expensive. This is hinoki. This is cypress, and it was shockingly expensive. I forget how much it was. It's 7 meters, right? And the dealer, he was saying, you think this is expensive, but let's think about this. This is Yoshino. This is Yoshino managed, for centuries. And if you zoom in, and this was this close up, if you zoom in here, what this is after 20 years, they limit. And 20 years, it hasn't grown very much. This is the diameter, right? If you think about it, I don't have a hand to anything for scale. But after 10 years, they limit. And you can see how cleanly this has been cut. And there's a technique not to have any tear out. So that limb gets cut perfectly, doesn't get infected, and it grows over. And so when you use this for a post, it is perfectly knot free. Unless you plane it down to its 20th year of growth, right? So if you were to count after this, how many years there were after this limit, the price for this is insignificant compared to the amount of time and effort that has been spent on this tree in order to make it Yoshino cypress. Right. So that's the idea of managed forests to the level that they have in some portions, not all over Japan, but the best of the best that's what they do. And so back to cedar, and Japanese cedar is what is primarily used for construction materials for the frame. And it's very, very noticeable because before it's been sun affected, you get a very nice delineation between the red heartwood and the white sapwood. And here you can see a close up. This, you actually get a kind of a graying as those layers go from sapwood to heartwood. And this, I'm a little bit of a maniac when it comes to this kind of stuff, but I keep samples of the wood that I use in order to explain it. And why the same species, this is all cedar, the same species, but based on where it grew, the amount of nutrition that it had, the amount of sun exposure, the growth is exceedingly different, is significantly different. So here on the far left, you have Yoshino. This is Yoshino cedar. And then you have cedar from my area. And you can see this is second growth or third growth or how many growths. This is definitely hand planted. But you can see how all the trees at the beginning of their life, when they're small, they want to get as big as they can in order to establish themselves. So they don't grow up very high very quickly. They grow up very wide comparatively, right? So you get this very, very quick growth, wide growth. So that this is 1 year of growth. I think everybody's aware is that these rings, you've got the dark line, which is the winter, and then you've got the spring, and then the summer. And in Japan, because you've got that hot summer after the monsoon. So if you compare it to a Western, a European or an American climate, where the most humidity occurs in the winter, when you have snowfall and what have you have relatively dry summers. It's still humid, but relatively dry summers. In Japan, you have dry winters and wet summers, right? So after the monsoon, there's lots of humidity in the ground, a lot of moisture. You can actually see the vegetation grow after the monsoon in July through August. And so the problem is that not that having wide growth rings is a problem when people are used to working with deciduous wood. It's not such a critical thing, but in conifer, especially cedar, is that you get this very, very hard, dense layer of winter growth. And then immediately you get this soft, spongy summer growth. which occurs only over a couple of months, and then it peters out into fall and then back into the winter. So I think I mentioned last session is that the reason why Japanese chisels are so sharp or have to be so sharp is because you have to cut through that hard layer that's being barely supported by the soft layer underneath it, sort of like trying to cut a millefeuille pastry. And so, of course, it's better to have close, very, very dense growth rings because that also leads to stability in the wood. But you have to work with what you have. And if you can work with this wood effectively, when it dries, its strength to weight ratio is really, really quite good because of that honeycomb structure of the summer growth in between the winter growth. Okay, so moving on, this is the cypress, and you can see the cypress is a little bit different in that it's got sort of an orangey, but I prefer seeing it as sort of a pink. When you cut it fresh, you see this pink heartwood, and it kind of comes through into the sapwood as well. And this is the growth ring. So cypress grows considerably slower than cedar. So as a result, you do get finer growth rings, and there's less of that difference between really, really high quality cypress and lower quality cypress. What you can see here, the way this cut is done, this is the end grain, and this what's been filled in the bottom here. This is a technique used for posts that are going to be visible in the structure. What you do is when the post is still green, you kerf it along the length of the post, and that allows it to contract. The circumference of the growth rings want to contract as it dries, and if you don't do this, you'll get line cracks on all four sides, or at least the side that has the center of the tree the closest to it. And you don't want to have that checking on something that's visible. So there's this technique to relieve that stress. And you can see how this is widened out. It's a triangular shape. And then I fill it in because it's going to be a visible part of the building, and you don't want to see that curve if you can't hide it in the wall somewhere. So that's cypress. And you can see this has also been limbed, but not nearly as cleanly cut as the example that I showed you from Yoshino. And then so when I talk to young carpenters and clients, I want to explain that Japanese wood is Japanese wood. And if we want to use domestic timbers, it kind of gives us the benefit of the best parts of the Japanese wood. It's aesthetics. But it also requires that we take the time to use it properly. And I'll get to that in the next couple of slides. So these are a couple of these species. There's cedar. I think you recognize cedar on the left. We've got the cypress, a piece of cypress with the bark still attached. And then I use sakura, cherry. These are two examples of it. The top is the wild cherry and the bottom is somayoshi. I don't use somayoshi very much because it grows way too quickly. It's what you see in the park. It's what's famous for the cherry blossoms. But I want to contrast it. You can see how much more dense the wild cherry is comparatively. And then next is the keyaki. And keyaki is beautiful. It's a zelkova. It's from the elm family. It's deciduous and it's beautiful, but it's very heavy. And so it's used in temples and for the main post, the daikoku bashira. I think people are semi-aware of the big main column in the center of the old buildings, the old farmhouses. It's not used very often for beams, mainly because of its weight. And then on the end here, we've got, this is chestnut. And chestnut is beautiful for its rot resistance, right? So in a lot of old farmhouses, you'll see it used for the mud sills and for the posts on the north side of the building. And because I think everybody realizes, I mean, most people who know chestnut knows that it's difficult to get long, straight pieces of it. It was actually planted in groves of faster growing nara, mizunara, which is a kind of an oak, a fast growing oak, kind of, when you say oak, it seems not to be a very fast growing type of tree, but in Japan there is a species that grows quite quickly. So the chestnut has to compete with it, so it grows nice and straight. So that was one of the forest management techniques. So the actual making the materials that people used a lot, they were thinking beyond one generation and preparing for the next generation's timber. And then, so this this next picture, this next picture is exactly the same, but I left out red. I left out red pine, the akamatsu, which is really, really necessary in Japanese architecture. We talked about it last time as being the large beams in the curved beams in the old farmhouses. So you can't have a selection without akamatsu or the red pine. And so when you've got those samples on the workbench and people come to the shop and they feel it, and I tell them to pick them up and feel the hardness of the corners, the sharpness of the corners, the weight, the plasticity of it. And then I bring this sample out. And sometimes I mix them up and I put the sample in with the Japanese woods, and I say there's one sample in the selection that isn't from Japan. It's from another part of the world, and see if you can find it. And most people don't. But this is Douglas fir. And Douglas fir has been imported to Japan for quite a long time. As soon as buildings became mechanized, the building of frames, the cutting of frames became mechanized, it was actually part of the deal. Is the mechanization, the CNC machining, could not make the traditional joints. They were too complicated. There were too many surfaces. And so they couldn't be made by the machines. And people at that time, they realized that the Japanese timber wasn't suitable for that. And so they had to import, or there was a deal to import Douglas fir, which is a fantastic building material. It's very hard, it's stable. The biggest problem is from the other side of the world. And I don't really think it's a good practice to import things from the other side of the world when you have a huge amount of domestic materials at hand that have been planted and prepared for you by previous generations. But Douglas fir is really, really hard comparatively. And so the simple joints that could be CNC'd, machined, would then be pulled together and supported by these metal fasteners. And these metal fasteners actually developed over time because there was a need for it. And the need is that in Japan, you've got lots of small earthquakes, and they're not enough to knock your house down, but they shake your house. And so you've got these metal fasteners connecting, pulling all your joints together. And after a small earthquake, the amount of force that's exerted on that joint is taken up by that metal fastener. And so the washers have developed over time because these washers bury themselves in the wood, and over time you get a loose connection. So there's a spring washer, and then a later iteration is a rubber coated cushion washer, all trying to mitigate this problem of not using wood and wood connections, mixing a significantly harder material like steel with a relatively softer, well, Douglas fir is quite hard comparatively, material. And so if you were to use the same technique with Japanese cedar, which is really, really soft, while you're building the building using a Makita impact driver, you would bury the the washer into the beam, right? So that's a problem because these joints require skill and training and experience to make. And without having that skill, experience, and technical know-how, it's not really safe to be using Japanese indigenous timbers and housing structures anymore. So that's one thing that I'm very active in is having people realize that. And that's why it's important for the younger generation to have these skills at hand to make use of the timbers that have been prepared for us to use in this country. So this is the gooseneck, kanna tsuite. It's used in various parts to splice two timbers together. I only use it for mud sills now because I know a little bit too much about the forces in the building, and I don't think that it's strong enough to be used for anything other than that. Not in the plates or the upper roof structure of the building. But what's interesting, this is the accepting side, and that was the male, and I guess you call this the female side. Is there's an evolution of the joint. So A very, very simple version, which is the most common one now, doesn't have these cogs on each side that are accepted in the male side. And the first time I made a building independently, I was a little worried about time, so I didn't make that in the mud sill connections, and I didn't understand why it was necessary at the time. And what I realized is that as the wood dried out, as it seasoned more and more, you get checking here. Because when you cut the joint of the receiving side of the female side, you're making a point where it's easy to crack. It's easy to check there because checking occurs from the center of the tree to the outside in the path of least resistance. So when you get checking there, what ends up happening is this widens apart the female width of the joint. This is actually a different joint, but I wanted to show it because I had the sample that was perfectly cracked in the way.
Cesar, how are you, man?
Oh, hello, hello. Doing well, doing well.
We do have, sorry, Adam, one question. Not sure what a mud sill is.
Okay, mud sill is a connection between the building and the foundation. So it's a horizontal piece that accepts Morse tenon joints from the posts, and it's in an old construction. It was laid on a stone foundation. In current construction, it's bolted down to a concrete foundation. So it's being bolted down onto the foundation. So it's not really dealing with a lot of stress. It's being supported by the concrete. So a joint as short as this, I think, is acceptable for that application. And I'm going to speed up a little bit because I realize there's a lot more pictures to show. So the cogs on each side, when the joint gets put together, it locks it together, and there's less checking that occurs from this point in the joint. And so this is a very, very simple addition to a joint, but it's incredibly important because as this female side widens out, the neck, the gooseneck of the joint, is only being supported by 6 millimeters on each side, right? So you really don't want that to widen out. So it's a small addition, but incredibly ingenious, specifically when you have wood that's not kiln dried. And the reason why you don't want to kiln dry structural wood in the Japanese environment is because it does this. There's so much humidity and they want to dry so quickly that it vaporizes on the inside of the inside of the wood, and it creates pockets of voids, which are very difficult to read from the outside of the timber. You only when you begin cutting it, you realize that there's some voids in it, which will affect the outcome of your joint. And I'm trying to zoom in, but you can see perhaps that there's a crack that was running right here on the inside of the timber, which caused the damage that you can see here. And so it's very, very difficult to cut joinery with kiln dried timber because you can't read where the damage is. So going to another very important splice, and the reason why I don't use the gooseneck for long structurally important pieces is because it's too short. And this is Kanawa Tsute. It's a long splice, and I'll run through these pictures so you can see how it comes together. I think some people are familiar with this. So as the two pieces get laid together, you can see that there's a void in between in the center here, which is just enough for the cogs on each side to begin to engage. And as you drive a wedge through the top, it widens that gap and takes up the difference that you need to start assembling the joint on each side. So by spreading apart the two pieces, you actually close the joint together. And all of these joints, these large joints, have that mechanical closing system because they're not relying on threaded bolts to pull things together. So there's this wood on wood connection, which is very gentle to the wood, very durable. Um, and it's designed to close and pull the joint tight over a long surface area. And I want to emphasize that requirement for surface area. And so when people say, well, this joint looks really, really complicated, um, why are there so many cogs on the side here? Why is that necessary? And it's necessary because the wood is so soft. And the only reason why you can get so many kilonewtons of holding force out of a bolt, which only has 1 millimeter on each side of the thread, or an M12, and there's only maybe 3 or 4 threads within the nut. The reason why you're getting so many kilonewtons out of that is because it's so hard. Whereas wood, specifically the cedar, is so soft, you have to have large surface area connections in order to get a reasonable amount of strength. And this is a sample of the same joint. And I use this to explain why it's necessary to have 2 cogs instead of just 1. Not just increase surface area, but because the same reason with the gooseneck is that you have a propensity to have a check running right from the center of the timber, because this timber has to have it's not clear free of heart. It has heart because the heart is in Japanese timber creates stability in the timber. If you try and have free of heart timber, it will bend incredibly to one side. So I like to try and keep heart within my timbers. But as a result, you get checking, and the joint itself, if you have 2 cogs, because the other side, you can see the check there a little bit more closely. The other side rarely checks, mainly because it has less of the center, and this one's right on center, right? So it's kind of perfectly sawed, but a little bit difficult. If the center was shifted over a little bit to the left, there would be very little, if no, chance for there to be checking on the right side here. So when you connect these together, you'll see how, and this one hasn't been left unconnected. This has been connected since it was cut. There's very little checking that can propagate from that dangerous spot if you have 2 cogs. So
Marty is asking if any adhesive is used on these joint connections.
no, no. And that's something we're going to get into, mainly because adhesives are very, very dangerous, mainly because what they do is they stop any kind of flex or leeway within the joint. And you want to have a mechanical connection for 2 reasons. One is that you want to have the ability for you're essentially making one timber out of 2 different trees, right, which were grown in probably different parts. They weren't grown in the same place. They weren't sawed the same way. They've got different personalities and different histories. And so they're going to want to move a little bit differently than each other. And these strong connections are intended to keep them together, but allow a little bit of that leeway for them to be able to be themselves, I guess is a good way to say it. If you were to try and use an adhesive to put the wood fibers together like a laminate, you have to use very, very weak wood. And that's why these laminated beams are made from very, very thin pieces of wood comparatively. And when you have these very, very thin pieces of wood being laminated together, you're really, really depending on that glue, that adhesive to be strong. And current adhesives are quite good when you're making very, very long span laminated beams. They're engineered. But I haven't worked on a 100-year-old laminated building yet. And so I'm not 100% convinced that it's as good as solid wood, mainly because solid wood is a natural system that was developed not to hold our houses together. It was developed to hold the tree up. So it's a natural system that I have a certain amount of confidence in. And so that's why adhesives are something that I don't work with. And the other idea is that these systems are such that you can disassemble the building. And so what I really enjoy is having the ability to assemble. That's why I like kanawatsuite as opposed to okake daisen, which is a very similar joint, which has a lot more friction in it. It's easier to put together, but there's so much friction. Is that when you put it together and you try and disassemble it, you might damage the joint to a certain degree. But what I can do with this kanawatsuite is by putting the wedge in from the top, I can test fit it in the shop, plane it if it's going to be visible, and then take it apart and transport it to the site. And on raising day, I know that it's going to go together well. It's going to be nice and clean, and I like that confidence. So I hope that answers the question about adhesives. And so this is what it looks like in situ. For this was one house that was done quite a few years ago. But as the beam gets larger in its height, or I guess you'd say the depth of the beam, I include more and more cogs. And it does take a little bit more time, but I think the client, when they see this in their house, they're pretty happy about it. And I can explain why it's important to take the time to make these pieces. So I was talking about the splitting and the cracking and the checking and those natural forces that occur in a building or in the timber when it dries, when it seasons, and how these joints can support that and to a certain extent mitigate that. But this is something else. And I hope this is also a video, so I hope I'll be able to show it. Here we go. This is a structural test of shear wall design that I was working with a couple of years ago. And this is very slow, but it's for that reason that you can see where things fail as shear is being added to a wall. Shear force is being applied to a wall. You can see how it fails, where the wood breaks and splits. And so a dynamic earthquake simulation happens too fast, and you don't have that time. So I like this approach. It's not as realistic as a shaping table, but it's a very good system for seeing how these systems react to force. And so the sound is wood being stressed, wood sliding on wood and wood connections sliding on each other, and the friction giving is that sort of popping sound. Nothing's cracking significantly yet, except you can see on the bottom left. This is where it's being pulled to the right. So the bottom left wants to rise up. It wants to be pulled up as shear is being resisted. And so there is cracking in that area. And I'll speed it up just a little bit so you can see failure. And this is where people were getting a little bit worried. People are starting to stand back, it's going to fail. It's being tested to fail. Cross braces are flexing the nuki, the lateral pieces. They're under tension. They're stopping the rake and the frame. And you can see that the bottom left is being pulled up still. And people are getting a little giddy. And we're actually being, people are saying if you stand back a little bit, I think it's going to start to go. And I'll go just a little bit because I don't want to waste time. Bang. And so you can see there where there was failure at the bottom. And everybody looking there, they had pictures of it. And that's a testing facility at a university in a neighboring province. So developing that data is really, really important to see how things fail because you want to have that in mind when you're building it. And I'm mixing traditional techniques. I think this is a maybe a little bit difficult to understand, but this wall design is a marriage between a traditional technique and a more recent technique. The cross bracings are not at all traditional, but they're important now because they resist the initial forces of the earthquake, but they do fail eventually, and it's those lateral pieces that will stop the building from falling down from pancaking. It's a very expensive approach, but it's also a very safe approach that I was developing a couple of years ago. So this is a close up to a section I wanted to talk about, and it was a learning process for myself, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because of these two joints approaches that I want to work with. What's on the left is an extension. It's just a tenon. It's an extension of the timber, and it's considered to be a very, very strong connection because all the wood fibers are continuous. It's pinned, right? And it's housed. But in order to put a frame together, in some cases, you can't always have those long tenons. To assembling the frame, you need some leeway. So I like to use this free tenon approach. And I really like it, but I always had in my mind that this was a weak connection comparatively. So it would weaken the frame, even though it was easier to assemble the frame. And this is the detail of how it's led into the post. But you can see that the one on the bottom is the long continuous tenon, and that's the video clip that we saw. We saw it fail because it was resisting the pull-up force in the frame. And then on the other side, this was from another test where I used the free tenon on the stressed side of the frame, the one that was being exerted to the end to failure. And you can see that the failure module was completely different. The long tenon, because it was stressed to failure, it failed completely. The long fibers, which are really, really strong, they resisted the force right until the end, until they broke. And then there was nothing holding the two pieces of wood together. And so when you see something fail in a test like this, it's not that it's weak, it just means that it's working as hard as it can. It's taking up all the force until it fails. And then you have nothing left to connect those two pieces of wood together. Whereas this floating tenon, this free tenon, what happened was really quite interesting. What it did is it did this. And so there was more slop in the frame comparatively. But when it was disassembled, it looked like this. There's a hairline crack running through here. It opened up. I mean, it had to open up because these pins were spinning, right? But once, after an earthquake, when the earthquake stops, this still has tensile strength. So the house isn't going to fall down. So for me, that was a very, very interesting exploration of what is strength. And in a Japanese environment with earthquakes, that's something that's really, really important to understand. And so this is after the test. I cut this out of the frame, and you can see that there is compression where it's being forced. But the piece itself is still functional. And so when I talked last session about the idea of houses being required to be fixed because of the amount of effort and time and material that it took to make them, that to scrap them and make a new one is unimaginable. So the idea that after even a large earthquake, the ability to fix the house was really important. And so this is another example of this joint. The reason it has these wedges, very similar to the splice that I was talking about, is it has a mechanical way of pulling the joint together. So this is being installed. You can still see a gap, which means that the joint's not closed. The length between the joint is still too long. It has to be closed up to dimension. So by driving these wedges in from the top, what it does is it pulls the pin connection. It pulls the free tenon, which has been pinned, into the pulls the timber into the free tenon. When they get hammered in, you can see the joint closes up quite nicely. And this is an example of it in situ being used to pull two beams together from the Daikoku Bashira in the center, the main post in the building. And so that is the amount I was going to talk about for joinery. And it's a very deep topic, lots and lots to talk about, and there's no way to cover it all in one session. So maybe at some point we can go into some more detail about some of the other interesting aspects of Japanese joinery.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that is a great time to wrap up and move into our conversation with Naoko, our organization's director. So, as this is the final part of this series, we wanted to hear just a little bit more about Adam's philosophy of his work and go into a little depth of that for our last couple of minutes. Um, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Joanne, and thank you, Adam, for this series. So now I'd like to dig deeper into what you have been seeing through your work in Japan. So you went to Japan to find out about architecture. What is it that you saw?
It's fantastic. One thing that comes to mind, one thing that was striking for me was that I had studied Japanese architecture from a very intellectual side. I had read books and I studied it in that area, and that was the purpose of coming to Japan. Is I wanted to see it in situ. I wanted to see it alive. But when I saw it being practiced, what was fascinating for me was this aesthetic of the curved roofs, of the soaring eaves, and all that sort of stuff is handmade. Uh, I had read books where there's a proportioning system based on calculations to make this beautiful curve, and, and it was almost like an Aristotle's textbook or Aristotle's textbook on mathematic beauty, which I thought was kind of very Japanese. You know, I thought it was kind of this rational approach to something, but I was so wrong. I was so wrong because that last slide, I wanted to cut it because we were running out of time, was my oyakata laying out the roof curve in 1-to-1 on the floor of his shop and spending days thinking about what that shape was going to be and how it was going to be the most beautiful. And he was trying to teach that to me. He was saying, you know, you have to understand what a beautiful roof line is. And I said, well, what is it? And he says, hold on, let's go outside. And in front of his shop, there's a Kageyama. It's a large mountain in my area. He says, you want to make a building look strong, look to the curve of the base of a mountain because that's naturally strong.
So do you think the way Japanese relate to nature is different from the West?
I think so. I think so. And it was interesting because before I came to Japan, I had traveled a fair amount, and I think it's one of those things where if you're to say, okay, well, Western thoughts on beauty, aesthetics, and nature are this, and you ask someone in the West, and they say, oh, I never thought about it. I don't know if it's like that. And I'd say, well, you know, it's obviously that the fish doesn't really think a lot about the quality of the ocean in which it swims, right? And I had been out of my ocean for a long time, so I was like the ultimate observer, right? And even so, if I these things I'm going to talk about, if you ask a Japanese person, they might say yes or no, I don't know. But there is a significant difference in our perception of beauty from a Western point of view and an Eastern point of view. If you do a little bit of research on ideas of, like, we don't say that we're based on Platonic or Plato's ideas. We don't say that we're based on Aristotle's ideas or what have you, but we are to a very large degree. If you look at, I'm not going to get into religion, but a monotheistical perception of perfection. Beauty is perfection. Plato says that forms are beauty, and so how much this table or this house or whatever, how close it is to the perfect form for the tree is just the definition of beauty, and it's very objective.
So you
And
think
I
the
think
definition of perfection is different in Japan compared to the West?
I think so, and that's why it's interesting to lead into this idea of nature. Is that nature is by no means perfect, but as a result, it is perfect. I remember I kind of like the golden ratio and Fibonacci sequence and everything. I kind of like it, but it's bizarre that everybody was excited the fact that nature was mathematical. It's like no. The natural balance could be defined mathematically. Is what happened. That's from a Western point of view. Whereas from an Eastern point of view, they just say, oh, that blossom's beautiful. right? Or the it's just balanced, right? But that idea of what is perfect, from an Eastern point of view, symmetry is not as important as a Western point of view. And in fact, last night I was at a hot spring, and I met a friend of mine, just chance, and I was talking about this because it was in my mind, and he was saying that he likes rhythm.
Mm.
And so the Japanese skip beat at the, I think if you've ever been to a Japanese festival, is the drum, up in the mountains, the villages, there is this kind of skip note which isn't necessarily symmetrical. It's that person's sound, and it's his expression of his sound, right?
Mm.
So I think there is some differences, and Japan has a long history of nature worship, but we don't even have to go that far. It's just saying that uh, when you live very closely to natural materials, when you look at Japanese houses where it's an expression of natural materials, they're not
Mm-hmm.
painted, they're not made perfect by a monotonal paint finish. Even the wall finishes, the white plaster, it has a modeling to it. It has a flecking in it, and it changes from area to area. When I was up in Ishikawa, the plaster is a different color because of the materials that they use.
Wow.
So that idea of saying, well, what is beautiful? And one thing that I like about Japan, and this is what I've kind of come to understand to a certain degree, is that because a lot of the idea of the aesthetics is brought from nature, is drawn
Mm-hmm.
from nature,
Mm-hmm.
it's not defined. Like, for example, if you say, oh, in Japan, everybody says, yes, the cherry blossoms are beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
right? Are beautiful. But when you say that, everybody just gets quiet and they say, yeah, yeah, yeah. They don't say why they're beautiful or what they think is beautiful because everybody's idea is so different. It's so
Oh.
personal. Their memory of the cherry blossoms dropping in the breeze might be iconic for this one person.
Mm-hmm.
The other person, what might be iconic is that perfect pink for them,
Right. Mm-hmm.
right? But it's a very personalized
Mm-hmm.
idea of beauty, and no one would ever say that. But I would imagine that Japanese idea of beauty is not objective like a Western idea of perfection. It's subjective. It's that person's opinion. And in a Japanese society where you're not really expected to give your opinion, it
Right.
becomes exceedingly personal because you don't have to present it to everybody.
Right.
You don't have to lock it down into your favorite color. In the West, you say, well, what's your favorite color? Well, it's blue. Right. You say,
Mm-hmm.
okay. But what shade of blue? I don't know. Tomorrow my shade of blue might be different. I don't know. Right. But if
It
you,
has a freedom to change.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And
Just
that
like
that
nature, maybe.
well, that's perfect. And you led
Mm-hmm.
you led the conversation in a perfect direction because that idea of, if an idea of beauty
Mm-hmm.
is personal, is subjective,
Mm-hmm.
and as an individual you change over time, then beauty also changes as a result.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you had this idea of, and I know a lot of people have probably done a lot of reading on Japanese aesthetics and that idea of wabi sabi and all that kind of idea of the beauty of the imperfect or the impermanent or whatever. And so, okay, so permanent beauty versus impermanent beauty versus, well, now we're getting into an intellectual process, which really has gotten us really far away from the idea of beauty, right?
Right.
You know, it's become a mental exercise, not how you feel when you see something. And so when you ask a Japanese person about, that, or when you say, yeah, the cherry blossoms are beautiful, or that the autumn colors are beautiful, they say yes, because they are, and that's it. Right? It
Mm.
doesn't have to be intellectualized. It doesn't have to be pinned down or mathematically defined or what have you, or
Interesting.
opinions established. And
Right.
so when your idea of beauty can change over
Mm-hmm.
time, the objects around you that change over time because things do change, they stay beautiful. I guess
Mm-hmm.
is a very key point of something I learned when I came here to Japan.
Interesting. Yeah. And are there any Japanese words that you feel they're hard to translate into English because of different ways of thinking or perception in general?
That is a very, very good point. That idea, I like one word very much, najimu. Najimu is something that for us shokunin, what we use a lot, craftspeople, they use a lot because when a tool becomes easy to use, teni najimu, you become used to it. it gets used to, you get used to it and it gets used to you because it changes as well. You can see some people, like I remember when I showed you guys the tile fabricator, the form that he used actually changed to fit his hands because he used it for so long, right?
Wow.
Um, so Najima is something that is very difficult. English is such a descriptive language that there's no leeway.
Right.
And that's a
Right.
big thing in Japanese language, is that it's a word that everybody uses as a way marker. You say yes, Najima, but as soon as you say it, you haven't explained so much that all of the interpretation disappears. In
Mm.
English, if you were to explain, you say, "Oh yeah, of course that happens. Oh yeah, of course." It doesn't get personalized. But when you say "najinderu," everybody's like, "Oh," and they think about the baseball glove they used to have,
Oh.
right? Or the flavor of the grandmother's stew, right? Or
Mm,
what
mm.
have you, right? It becomes a very personal, uh, feeling based reaction to a word.
I guess another word that comes to my mind is 使い込む. 使い込む means it gets better with more use.
Now that's an exciting idea, and that's something that I wanted to bring up a lot in this series, and I think I've kind of touched on it from time to time. Is that idea of having things around you for a long time is really comforting, I think, because that idea of najima, of being used to it. But then when Naoko, when you bring that up, that word up, is that the idea that if you take care of something, it gets better. Wow. I mean, that means that things don't get bad around you. They don't get worn out or used. They get better. I mean, that's a fantastic way to live, you know?
I'm sure your tools are like that, right?
Well, of course, of course. I mean, it's they become like good friends to a certain extent because you have to depend on them.
Mhm.
You know, they're the reason why I can do what I can do. And as a result, people say, okay, well, there's sometimes you see on the internet is that there's this tradition of on New Year's to offer things to your tools or what have you. I mean, that becomes a little bit too mistaken, I think, with how it's perceived, is that there's this idea of spirituality or what have you. I mean, we all are very spiritual beings as the fact that we are what we are. But the idea is that if you take care of things, you like them, and you like them, so you take care of them, and they become something you depend on, and they of course depend on you, because if you don't take care of them, they rust and they fall apart, and they disappear.
And I believe that leads to sustainability as well. If the longer you use your tools and cherish them.
Exactly. It was funny. I think now we talked about this just a little bit earlier. Is this idea? I had lunch with some friends. We were having a practice, and so everybody brought out, plates of food that they had prepared, and dishes and everything like that. And of course, everybody brought out their my hashi, my chopsticks, which is, it was a catchphrase quite a few years ago in Japan, is that people wanted to stop using disposable chopsticks, so they said my hashi, and it kind of plateaued and kind of disappeared, right? But my friends, a lot of them are very, very like-minded in that way, and they didn't even skip a beat. They didn't even stop, change anything. They just took out their chopsticks, mainly because they like using their chopsticks that they got used to. And so this is this bridge between this idea of sustainability. I mean, we have to force people to stop throwing things away, or we have to educate people that this is more important for the world or what have you. But if people just like what they have and want to keep using it, then it becomes a natural way of doing things. Um,
And it leads to the word もったいない, the spirit of もったいない in Japanese.
yeah. I mean, yeah, motainai is this word that comes up and means taught to all the kids, that don't waste things, don't waste stuff, and this is the way that it gets translated into English, but it goes beyond that. It says treat things important, like they're important, respect things. And so is this idea of, when you say that, well, why would you respect something? Why should you treat something well? And I think Naoko, when we talked about this before, you had this, you just said it. You said, of course, because somebody made it.
I do want to note, sorry to interrupt, we are now at 7. We are going to continue our conversation for a little bit and still have space at the end for anyone who'd like to share their thoughts and opinions. through the video or through chat, so we will go on a little further, but for anyone who does have to leave for other obligations, we completely understand, and thank you so much for joining us thus far, but please continue.
Thank you. So do you want to give a conclusion of your presentation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's been a fantastic opportunity to think about stuff. I mean, it's been a great opportunity for me to be able to share these things because I have to run them through my mind again. And some of the things that became sort of just a way of doing things became an opportunity to reevaluate stuff for me, right? So I really value this opportunity. I really appreciate it. I also really appreciate that we had so many people come in and share time with us on this. It makes me feel good that other people have a similar idea. And what I really like about my time here in Japan is that I have this funny, well, I would say good fortune of meeting interesting people who share similar ideas. And when you do that, it becomes like a synergy where you just add to what you're working on with your life. So having people across the ocean here in Japan as well tuning in and sharing the conversation, I think is really valuable. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you so much, Adam. Joanne, you can take the Q&A now.
So if anyone would like to jump in, raise their hand, or include in the chat any last questions, or even just sharing their thoughts on what they've heard tonight or in previous parts. I see Jitka potentially may have a comment, or
yes, hi, Adam.
Hi, hello.
Brother. I was really interested in is this dichotomy of all of the spirit and the energy that goes into the manually produced house. How is that reconciled with the mechanically produced house that is presented as an equivalent, but it's mechanically made?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I mean, I spent a lot of time with industrial design, and so that idea is that yeah, I mean, in an economy, in a situation where we need to have enough housing for people, I see the value of both. I see the value of both, but they should not be equal, as I think what you're getting at. They are not equal, right? And so,
but why don't we just build 2x4 houses then?
What's that?
Why not build then mechanically made houses with 2x4s and the way quickly produced houses? Why go to the lengths of replicating the joinery?
Well, there's twofold. One is that I think that it's important for human beings not to lose their skill sets. I mean, as a species, we should continue developing our skill sets and extending ourselves, and we have. I mean, with fantastic stuff. And so I'm not saying that we should go back 100 years and live that way. I say we should not forget what we could do 100 years ago, and there needs to be people who can still do it. And so that idea of if there's still the place to make these houses, we should definitely continue, mainly because it's not something that you should do as lightly as your hobby or something like that. It needs to be a professional approach because of the responsibility that somebody has professionally to their clients, and to extend themselves to make it even better for the person who's going to come and use it as their house to raise their kids and to spend their time in growing, right? And not only that, is a person like me, I mean, I do the end result, I make the pieces and put it together, but the people who make the tools that I need to use, the people who process the timbers and dry them and take all of that in Japanese, tsumikasanari, the building, the layering of all that experience and technique and wisdom should still be relevant to a certain degree. But we can't, I mean, I'm not going to say, yes, we have to make all the houses this way because we wouldn't have enough of them. Right? It takes too long, right? We'd all have to live in the same house, right? We have to have communal housing, which is maybe not a bad thing, but we should have both together and not throw away one in order to just focus on the other, is I guess what I'm saying. And that's a fantastic question. Thank you.
all right, this will be the last call for any questions or comments.
I
But
have a comment.
Yes, please go
Hi,
ahead.
this is Kat. I'm in Maine. And I just wanted to say that one of the takeaways from this presentation for me was just the profound amount of respect that all of these craftspeople are paying to every material type, whether it's wood, whether it's clay, whether it's stone, that each craftsperson is like truly communing with each piece, each tree that was cut down, each stone that was laid to just create the the best solution for the human, but also just allowing that material to live to its best capacity in that architecture. So thank you for really allowing us to appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm really happy you picked that up. There's this word in Japan, in Japanese, which I really, really like. It's ikasu. Ikasu. And if you try and translate it, it's very difficult to raise it up, to make best use of, to draw out the best of it. So when you have a carpenter, a really rough old guy, and he says, "Kono ki kasu wa tarimai da," to make the best use of this wood, to raise up, to draw, everything you said is obvious. I mean, that's his reason for being. That's what he's been doing, spending his life on. And so I'm really happy we had a chance to talk about that with Naoko, about that idea of it was very, very short. I mean, it's a very deep topic, but I think we kind of showed a little bit about is that idea of looking back to nature as being a personal interaction of how you see the beauty in that object, in that material, in that tree, in that stone, and what have you, is that that's yours to do. And as a result, you start feeling that connection and that not necessarily responsibility, but a desire to do that. And I'm really happy you picked up on that.
All right,
And
if there's, all right, I'll let you make your final.
yeah, I guess I'll just reiterate. I mean, I really, really like the depth of the questions throughout the series that have come up, and the fact that I really feel that people are engaging with the topic. And it'll be a pleasure at some point to meet any of you or all of you in person. That's that idea. You know, Zoom is really, really fantastic for allowing these kinds of conversations. But I also see it as a starting point because people who have similar ideas and ways of seeing the world have a tendency to come together. And so it would be a pleasure to meet any one of you, all of you at some point. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Adam. I guess we all have an open invitation to go see all the houses in person in Japan if anyone can make it. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Adam. And we hope everyone has a great rest of their evening or their day. And please look forward to other events put on by the Japan Society of Boston.